welcome once again to Battleground Ideas, where faith, philosophy, and culture collide. I'm Chuck Mason, and I want to welcome you back to the podcast and say thank you because I know that your time is important. Today we're going to continue our series on how do I talk to my kids about social justice. In today's episode, we're going to break down the LGBTQ agenda, and I'm going to give you the basic principles that drive this so that you'll have the tools and the strategies to be able to have effective conversations with your kids to challenge the ideology and its effect that it has. This episode is the second of a series, and to really understand what's going on here, you really will need to listen to You Speak Facts, They Speak Emoji, which sets all the cultural assumptions for what's happening moving forward. If you haven't listened to that episode, please go back and do. I will put the link down below in the comments section. As we start, there's no better demonstration of a post-truth Marxist worldview that we talked about in You Speak Facts, They Speak Emoji than the LGBTQ agenda. Let's start with the trans community and the use of post-truth emotions as an attempt to define reality. If you remember back to You Speak Facts, They Speak Emoji, we talked about how traditional America has used logic, observation, data, science, rational thought to define characteristics about the reality of gender in traditional America. And that would have been Aristotle has a Y chromosome. All human beings that have a Y chromosome are male. Therefore, Aristotle is a man. But the rejection and the destruction of that by the postmodern movement and the subsequent use of a post-truth approach to the world where emotions, feelings, preferences, and desires are used to define reality have given us this. Aristotle has a Y chromosome. Aristotle feels like a woman. Therefore, Aristotle is a woman. In the transgender world, gender is fluid. There is the absolute rejection that male and female is defined by biology or within the oppressive distinctions drawn from the Judeo-Christian worldview and traditional male and female categories. In the contemporary transgender movement, gender is fluid and it's defined by a person's emotional content and preferences. In the trans world, if someone has a Y chromosome and said that they identified as a woman, they would come to that decision based upon their feelings. If you would ask them, and of course this is the only criteria they would have, it's nothing to do with biology or chromosomes. It is, I feel most centered as a woman. I feel at peace with being a woman. I feel more natural being a woman. I feel as though this is my correct state. In the post-truth mindset, feelings and emotions dictate reality. If someone has a Y chromosome and feels as though they are a woman, then the rest of the world must accept that as reality and treat them accordingly and confer upon them all rights, privileges, and access to all spaces and activities that any human being with two X chromosomes would enjoy. If you are coming from a traditional American mindset, like we had discussed, you're asking yourself, how did we get here? And that is where the contemporary Marxism comes into play. Once again, I'll reference You Speak Facts, They Speak Emoji, where I talked about one of the central features of Marxism is that, in fact, Karl Marx proposed that it was the social structures that people lived in, the societal institutions that created everything about humanity, right down to a person's thoughts, which means everything about human beings is socially constructed. This means that everything about gender and sexual identity or sexual preference has nothing to do with biology, and certainly even less with the concept of God creating men and women with inherent differences that are expressed as a result of their biology. From a Marxist perspective, gender can be anything a society says it can be, or any individual. Now, to be fair, this aspect of the thought of Karl Marx that's led to this current position is really one of the more minor or esoteric parts of his philosophy. But it's a central feature to this post-truth Marxist worldview. Gender has nothing to do with biology. Gender is all about social conditioning, which means two things. The first is that the form of gender that comes through the traditional American worldview, which was based upon logic and the influence of biblical principles, is nothing more than a lie, a form of oppression that was perpetuated from generation to generation and forced down upon all of humanity starting in infancy. This has kept people bound up and oppressed and robbed them of their true freedom and ability to express themselves as they see fit, as their emotional content and their preferences and desires dictate the way that they should be. And that is precisely the second point. Gender is whatever any individual says it should be, whatever group within society, whatever social institution dictates that it can be. There should be no restrictions whatsoever. If it seems a little bit difficult to comprehend that there actually should be no restrictions, the post-truth Marxist worldview refuses to accept any restrictions or limitations on expressions of gender or sexuality. This is the primary reason why we have LGBTQ plus and then further extensions within this identity politics subgroup. Now let me explain. Originally it was lesbian and gay, and then it was bisexual. And as the push for greater acceptance of diversity within this community gained more and more traction, and the social barriers began to fall away, there became the greater expansion and a push for acceptance within the transgender community, and really their normalization back into every sphere of life within America. As the push continued and the barriers came down, conservatives responded that eventually there will be no boundaries, no barriers, and there ultimately will be the demand for anything and everything to be acceptable, and the demand that everything and anything should be greeted with infinite, unfettered tolerance. The response from the left was, how dare you imply that people would ultimately want to end up marrying an animal or a robot with the capacity for sexual intimacy, or the demand that the, quote, minor attracted persons, comma, or those that want to have sexual intimacy with children would actually step forward and demand legitimacy. But that's where we are, because if everything is socially conditioned, then whatever society or whatever subgroups within societies, within institutions deem should be correct and acceptable, then those things must and necessarily should be accepted. So it started with LGB, then added T, and then it added Q, and then it added Q+. Now, the Q portion of this is more open-ended. However, what's emerging within Q is a community of people called otherkin or otherkind. And those are individuals who believe that they are some other form of life trapped in a human body. So you could have wormkin, catkin, dogkin, fairykin, treekin, firmkin. And you guessed it. People who think that they're a cat, a dog, a fairy, a worm, a tree, a fern, all believe that they are truly those forms of existence that are trapped in human bodies. And because they are self-affirming from the standpoint of their emotions, their feelings, their preferences, and their desires, they are demanding that the world affirm their positions to be concrete reality every bit as much as the individual has a Y chromosome is demanding to be afforded all human rights and protections as though he had two X chromosomes. Do you see how this works and where this is going? And we can't leave out the fact that, as I had predicted in a podcast years ago, the minor attracted persons, those people who believe that it is entirely permissible and appropriate to have, quote, consensual sexual intimacy with children, even though children would not be able to give informed consent, they are emerging with a loud, strident voice demanding the same level of acceptance as anybody else within the LGBTQ umbrella. I realize that's a lot of information and that it's difficult to hear, but it is going to be critical when you have conversations with your kids. All of this comes into play as you challenge the agenda, which is where we're going to shift to right now. So you've got the information basically about the philosophical assumptions behind it and how it's playing out. The question is, what do we do? Now that we've reached the point of talking about how do I dialogue with my kids, you'll find another podcast in this series that's going to talk specifically and guide you through how we set up having these conversations. This is a process that's going to take building relational groundwork with your kids. Some families may have already set the stage for this, while others realize that they need to be spending more time and bonding with their children. But I really want to warn you, if you take this information as facts and you come barreling in with it, saying, well, what about this? And this is illogical and this doesn't make any sense, you're going to drive them further into woke. Trust me, I know, because I did it. What you have to do to be effective here is to work within the failures, the fundamental assumptions within the ideology and the way it works within culture. And you have to ask questions as a part of conversation. The questions are critical. You cannot do this work without questions. And the reason is questions cause people to open up and expand their fundamental assumptions. It's actually one of the most important tools in debate or apologetics. Here's the reason why. People set up arguments and conditions and examples and situations in the world that work within a very narrow set of assumptions, but fail when you move them beyond those assumptions. And in doing that, you help them understand the failure of the original set of conditions and the failure of their own position. It opens their mind up to seeing it because you ask them a question that made them think, rather than coming at them with an argument and logical facts that immediately makes them defend. Here's how this works, and here's how it worked with my own sons. So after nearly losing my mind hearing the defense of the trans agenda and how I was being a hateful transphobe bigot because I didn't want to accept that an individual who had a Y chromosome could demand that they were a woman at any given instant, and I needed to accommodate that, I chose a different task. I chose to ask some questions, and here how it. First, I'll give you the philosophical setup. If gender is a social construct, then anything else can be a social construct, especially things that they do not want to be socially constructed. But if we're going to accept that gender can be socially constructed, then what about race? People would agree that race can be socially constructed, but within narrow confines. So here's how it went. I looked at my sons and I said, particularly my oldest at the time, and I said, okay, what is the basis by which somebody decides their gender at any given moment? And they would hem-haw, and I'm like, it's their feelings, right? And they're like, well, okay, yeah, you're right. That's what they feel. They feel better as a woman, so who are you to tell them that they can't be a woman if that's what makes them feel centered and right within the world? I was like, okay, so this is all about the way somebody feels. Okay. Then I looked at them and said, all right, what if I felt like I was black? And they were like, no way, you can't do that. You're a white male. You can't do that. And I looked at them and said, if it's okay that someone who has a Y chromosome feels like they're a woman and they're biologically not a woman, I said there's nothing wrong with me identifying as black, even though I have no black characteristics. If it's all about feelings, then it should work. And of course, you can expect the response that I got. But then I pushed it one step further, because if it's all socially conditioned, it's all socially conditioned. If it's all about feelings, perceptions, perspectives, desires, wants, all of that, and if feelings and preferences dictate reality, then let's push it even further. And I said, so yeah, while I'm thinking about it, then I'm female. So at this moment, you need to acknowledge me as being black and female. And the venom of the response amped up, and I pushed it further. And I said, so I'm over 50 and have done a lot of physical work in my life, so there are times I wake up with aches and pains. And I said, based upon the way that I feel and the level of pain that I have in my body, I'm disabled. And since I'm identifying as a woman and I happen to be attracted to women, then I identify as a lesbian. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to update my resume as a black, female, disabled lesbian, and I am going to compete within the corporate job world looking for preferences within the affirmative action rules that govern hiring. My oldest son was far along enough in years to recognize the impact of that possibility. And at the time, he was a bit horrified and said, "You can't do that." And I said, "Yes, I can, because if it's all conditioned based upon feelings and society, then anything is fair game." He wanted to dismiss that argument and move on to something else, and I refused to let him do that. And what I said to him was this: "Look, we're not going to have any more conversation about this until you can give me a valid reason why it's okay for someone with a Y chromosome to identify as female and demand that they be recognized in terms of concrete reality as being a woman. Well, it's okay for that, but it's not okay for me to identify as though I'm black, a woman, a lesbian, and disabled, using your same criteria." And I let him sit in it. And there are times when other things would come up in conversation that were parallel, and I would say, "I love you, bud, but I can't move forward in this conversation until you're willing to tell me why it's not okay for me as a white, straight, middle-aged, heterosexual male to identify as all of these characteristics using the criteria that they have set forth. And until you're able to tell me why that is not okay and the other one is okay, I'm really not comfortable moving forward within this conversation because my question is valid and I really need an answer." For all of you parents, do you see how this works? What needs to happen here is that you need to understand how these ideologies work and look for the internal inconsistencies and highlight the way that those impact your kids or their friends or the society or the world that they're going to live in. And you could do this with the impact of the Y chromosome on women's high school and collegiate athletics. As biological males continue to crush women's sports, you can ask your kids a series of questions. Start with a question. Set the parameters that you're going to use when you propose a different scenario. It would work like this. You could look at it and say, so it's a form of oppression and intolerance if we don't acknowledge that somebody with a Y chromosome is a female when they identify as female. Why isn't it a form of oppression when that individual with the Y chromosome is out on the track field crushing high school athletics because they have an unfair biological advantage? How is that not oppression? And why is it so important for the feelings of that individual to override the feelings of an entire group of young women who have been working incredibly hard for their entire lives? Ask, isn't this a form of patriarchy? I mean, it's a Y chromosome dominating over two X chromosomes. And if that's the case, aren't you facilitating a brand new form of patriarchy all over America? Aren't you concerned about the rights of human beings with two X chromosomes who are comfortable being women, who identify as being women? Aren't you concerned about them being dominated by the Y chromosome, which has been considered patriarchy within the modern feminist movement for the last 60 years? And also, you can capitalize with questions about the Q category, meaning catkin, wormkin, fairykin, and say to them, okay, if we're going to agree that people choose their gender based upon their emotional content, how are we going to deal with people that say they're a cat based upon emotional content? Really, do we put a litter box in your classroom? Do we have a litter box in a bathroom? If you had a child that came to you and said, "I'm a frog," are you willing to raise him as a frog? The blowback you're going to get is, "This is ridiculous and how dare you?" And what you have to do is say to your child, no, it isn't ridiculous. Because if an individual with a Y chromosome can declare they're a woman at any given moment, and everything is culturally conditioned, then there's nothing to say that the individual who considers themselves to be a cat or a frog should be denied that reality because of your intolerance. Because if you deny them that reality, that's precisely what it is: intolerance, oppression, and victimization. Based upon what the trans community is saying. It's important to raise these questions without anger. Let them be legitimate questions. Put them in that context, because then they're going to think. If you phrase it like, well, what am I supposed to do? If somebody acts like they're a frog and thinks and feels like they're a frog, am I supposed to say they're a frog? You're on the attack and you're frustrated, you're hurt, and you're afraid, and they know it, and all you're going to get is the defensive response and the argument. But if you look at them and go, hey, I'm just asking a question. If it's okay with somebody with a Y chromosome to say they're a woman in any given moment, and it's all based upon the way they feel, what about when someone says that they're a cat or they're a frog? Because people are saying that. What about Catkin? How far is this going to go? I mean, what should we do if somebody shows up in your school and says that you have to engage them as though they're a cat, and a litter box shows up within your school bathroom? Because that's a real possibility. Keep this as questions, legitimate questions, because they are legitimate questions. Keep them as legitimate questions that they need to answer for themselves. And don't let the conversations that come from those questions come from your fear and your anger. What I would do with my children was, when I would pose those questions and they would sit and they would ruminate and they would come back and try to dialogue about something else, I would be like, I really can't until I get an answer for this, or until we're really able to talk, because I'm concerned. And I would look at them and say, can I tell you why I'm concerned? And I would just look at them and say, look, if anybody who's a male can look at me and go, I'm a woman right now based upon the way I feel, I said, what's to stop anybody from feeling anything and demanding that the rest of the world accommodate whatever they're feeling at any given moment? Is this really the world you want to live in? Is this really the world that you want created around you? And are you prepared for the consequences? Are you prepared to show up for a job and some white heterosexual male is identifying as a black lesbian female who's disabled? When that person gets the job based upon an affirmative action hire, when they're really a white heterosexual male like you, and you're more qualified than they are. Because that's what's going to happen if you allow this to play itself out in time without any challenges whatsoever. In order to be effective with this, you really have to begin to investigate and understand the trans movement inside and out, to be able to effectively ask questions that are informed, so that you feel confident using the tools and not resorting to emotions and arguments. And do your best to bring it home to within the context of their schools and your own community. Do they know a female athlete that's losing to a male athlete identifying as a trans woman? Then talk about how the girl who is losing to the Y chromosome must feel. Talk about the impact that it will have on her future as an athlete. Ask, is this really fair? And more importantly, is this really right? And remember that this can be a long game. This may not happen overnight, and it may take some time, but eventually the inconsistencies mount up. The absurdity of all of this will become apparent. And trust the process, because it works. Thank you for spending time here once again at Battleground Ideas, where faith, philosophy, and culture collide. I'm Chuck Mason, and until the next time we're back together, I want to say thank you for being here, because I know your time is important. You can reach us with comments, criticisms, or anything you'd like to add at chuck@battlegroundideas.com. Please like and share, and until the next time, God bless.
Thank you.